Everyone, I want to thank everybody for coming. We were a little worried with the weather. This is a great turnout. This is very nice. My name's Steve Norsini. I'm your township engineer. I want to recognize Commissioner Kathy Agnew over on the other side there. And here we are. So this is a very exciting project, one I've been a proponent of for a long time, and I know the board is. That's why they funded this, and it's very exciting. Some great results to come. I'm going to turn it over now to Adam Texa, our consultant.
Thanks very much, Steve. Hi, everybody. I am Adam Texa with FHI Studio, now IMEG. So I'm going to kick us off. I know many of you have been to the presentation at the Board of Commissioners, or maybe watch the video or visit the website. So I'm going to give sort of an abridged version of that presentation, just to make sure that we're all on the same page as sort of about what this project is. I'm going to start off with a project overview because it's spooky and it's Halloween. No? Come on. All right. I thought of that today. I liked it. So here's the consultant team for you. These are going to be the people who are going to be kind of the face of this. We all have teams behind us, but I'm with FHI Studio now IMEG. Megan is with Walker Consultants. She's going to be doing a lot of the parking analysis, which we'll be talking about later. And then Michael is here to lead the retail stuff, who's going to be doing the majority of the presentation. A little bit of background on this project. So many of you are familiar faces and participated in a vision for Radnor. That was the comprehensive plan that we did. We did this survey almost a year and a half ago now, where we asked people to, sort of give us some feedback of where the township needed to be improved. And one of the activities that we did is this was like a phone internet activity where you could drop a dot on locations where you wanted to see things change. And this is what we got, right? You looked at all the comments, there were comments all over the place, but there was this big red glowing dot right around Wayne. And people were talking about housing and historic preservation and open space and mobility and design and land use, just a whole bunch of issues. And so we saw this and we recognized that DVRPC, Delaware Valley Planning Commission, has a grant that's called the Transportation and Community Development Initiative. And so the township went out and applied for that grant to do a plan for that area. All right, so recognizing that it was a really key issue, but it wasn't something that we were going to be able to get into in a lot of depth in the comprehensive plan because we're talking about the entire township and so many different issues. They were awarded that grant and have made some sort of matching contributions to that. That is going to look at a parking analysis, Mike's work on the business attraction and retention, and some additional and public engagement that wasn't going to be possible under the DVRPC grant. So we're going to be doing a lot of planning work. This is the study area. It's up on the website, but it's basically the Wayne Business Overlay Zoning District with a little bit of area tagged on the north side of Wayne Station, on the north side of the tracks. We're going to be looking at a lot of previous plans. Again, this presentation is up on the website for you to go through in detail. We're going to be responding to a lot of the comments and the ideas that were brought up and sort of flushing out those ideas from the comprehensive plan. We're going to do some existing conditions analysis where we look at like demographics and the transportation network, the public realm. There's going to be a lot of things covered on that. We're going to be doing and have done a parking study where Megan actually went out and counted all the cars that were parked during the day in all the lots, and we pulled all the data. So if you use Park Mobile or you use the kiosks, we pulled all of that data so that we really understand how parking is working in the area, because we know that's an issue that a lot of people raised. And then we're going to be doing a lot of retail work, which Mike is here to talk a little bit about today and sort of give you an overview of the Retail 101. So this, yep.
Could you, when you click the board there, could you make it just a little bit slower and make it more?
I will, but I'm also going to say this. If you're interested in the details of this, I gave a presentation that's recorded on the website, and you can actually grab this presentation and look through it, because I want to make sure that we've got enough time for Mike to really get into the meat and potatoes of what we're doing.
I'm sure all that other is important, but it was just so quick, it was hard to.
I understand. And there is going to be a lot more opportunities to get into all of this, and I'll be making this presentation in more detail. So we're going to be doing public and stakeholder engagement along the way. You've all hopefully seen the website. That's going to be where you can always access information. Please sign up for project updates. We're not going to like sell your email address to anybody. We're just going to email you when we get drafts going out, when there are opportunities for public engagement. We're going to do a lot of stakeholder engagement, talking with businesses. I hope everybody is aware that this Saturday from 10 to 3, we are going to be in Wayne. There's going to be a big tent in that sort of parking area right off of North Wayne Avenue. And we've got 16 activities for you all to show up and give your input and give your thoughts on. And there's going to be a lot of information about kind of like what we're doing, how we're going to be going about it, but it's also going to be your all's first time to really like start to provide us your thoughts and ideas about what should happen in Wayne. We'll have some meetings, so we're going to have the open house, not tentatively anymore, definitely on Wednesday. We're doing the Downtown Retail 101 today. We're also going to be doing a workshop later in the process, and we're going to be making many presentations to the Board of Commissioners. The final plan is going to talk about all of these concepts: land use, business attraction and retention, parking, multimodal mobility, which means walking, biking, taking transit, taking the train, taking the bus, driving, housing diversity and affordability, stormwater management and resiliency, placemaking, which is basically the idea of like public spaces and public, the quality of sidewalks and the public realm. And then it's going to include an action plan and an implementation strategy. All right. So I know that's a lot. Don't worry too much about it. There's going to be a lot of opportunities to engage. If you have any questions along the way, there's an email address on the website. That's a great way, if you've just got a question that you can't find the answer to on the website or through this thing, send us an email. We'll get you some information back. But today, what I want to talk about is, I'm going to skip over the timeline here, is I really want to hand it over to Mike to talk a little bit about Retail 101. I want to put this in a little bit of context. So the whole idea of this is an educational opportunity for all of us to sort of learn a little bit about business attraction and retention, how this works. We're going to have an opportunity at the end for you all to ask questions. But I would really hope that you focus your questions on like getting more information about kind of like what Mike does, how he does it, what the plan might address. And then at the workshop on Saturday, that's the time to start to sort of share ideas or thoughts about how you think we should do what you're looking for in Wayne. All right? Does that make any sense? Great. Well, I'm going to hand it over to Mike then.
Do you know how to get back?
I can probably figure it out. Let's see here.
The one on the right, actually.
Is it?
Because I want to be able to see the notes. Yeah, that's
Yeah,
perfect.
yeah, that's,
perfect.
yep.
Okay. All right, thank you. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming tonight. I, too, was a little nervous because of the weather, but it seems to have cleared up a bit. So what I'm going to try to talk about is this subject that I've devoted my life to, but which, to me as well, was not very intuitive when I first started doing it. I mean, I don't know. I grew up seeing stores on my local main street and not really thinking how they got there or why they stayed there. I just felt like it probably all dropped manna from heaven and never really tried to analyze what I saw. What I learned as I really got into this field is that there actually is a science to it. It doesn't explain everything. And especially in downtowns, there's also a lot of art as well. And I'm going to try to demystify some of that tonight. with the hope that it will help in this process to get us further along towards where we want downtown Wayne to go. Before I start, though, this is going to quickly get into some terminology which can at times sound a bit jargony. If there's something you're not understanding or is unclear to you, do raise your hand. And again, only if it's a question where it's something that doesn't make sense or is unclear to you. And I'll try to clarify, because this stuff is cumulative. If you miss something that I'm saying now, something else I say in 10 minutes won't make any sense either. So with that in mind, just a few words about myself. I was originally a planner, started to get frustrated with that because I felt a lot of planning was not always rooted in market and real estate realities. So I kind of diverted into commercial revitalization, how we resuscitate our downtowns and our main streets. Back in the early aughts, that was still necessary. Obviously, our downtowns and main streets have come a long way in the last 2 decades. I do that from a base of 2 different places, New York City and the San Francisco Bay Area, work across the US and Canada and the UK. I have done a lot of work across Greater Philadelphia, Center City, Northern Liberties, University City, Manayunk. Right now I'm also working in Chinatown. And that's me, with a tiny bit more hair, but not much. And so the first thing I want to say is, why do we even care about this? I mean, why is retail even important? Well, it's important for some obvious reasons, for our tax base, but it's also important because of all the different property types. It's the one use that everyone can see and assess, right? We don't know what's going on upstairs. We don't venture into every subdivision across the township, but we do see the retail. And that drives our perceptions of this place, whether we're from outside or whether we live here, right? And so it actually works on how people think of your community, much more than you might imagine. It's the first impressions, not only that visitors get, but potential investors, would-be residents. And for better or worse, they will draw initial conclusions based on what they see on the ground floor, because it's sometimes the only thing they have to go on, right? Even just think about the difference of going into a downtown, you see a Gucci store versus a Dollar Tree, right? Just that basic difference. If everything else is held the same, you draw different conclusions about the place, right? So that's why I've always found it quite fascinating from a sociological perspective, but also very important for the lives of communities. And this is one of my favorite quotes about retail, because we all do it, right? We all shop, we all eat, a lot of us caffeinate, a great many of us drink, we'll go to the movies from time to time, right? We do all of that. Unlike office or industrial, this is the commercial use that everyone can have and does have an opinion about, right? The thing is that a lot of it's not very intuitive. And some of it actually, the reality is the opposite of what you might think. And that's one of the reasons why I've always liked this quote from Mark Twain. You might remember it from the beginning of that movie, The Big Short. It ain't what you don't know that gets you in trouble, it's what you know for sure that just ain't so. There's a lot of that in retail. And journalists don't always help. A lot of lazy journalism out there, which kind of confuses or oversimplifies issues when it comes to retail. So hopefully today we can get into those. One of them I want to start with is this thing called e-commerce, which obviously has been with us now for a good quarter of a century. And there are many who still even today believe that it has not only vanquished brick and mortar retail, but one day is going to be the way we shop for everything. There's still a lot of people who will say that with not a bit of doubt, right? I myself am very bullish on brick and mortar because we just had this great experiment, the COVID pandemic, where if there was ever a moment that brick and mortar would be vanquished, by e-commerce. That was it. And it didn't happen, right? If you actually tracked the market share of e-commerce during the years of the pandemic, right? In the end, the percentage of retail sales that are generated online was not that much different from what it would have been given historical growth trends. Right? Yes, it spiked in 2020, but eventually, as you got to the end of 2022, it's pretty much where we would have expected it to be without the pandemic. Right? Yes, it continues to grow. Right? But I think what we did learn during the pandemic is there's a ceiling to what we are willing or want to shop for online. Right? There are some things which, for reasons that aren't always clear, we as consumers prefer to have in store, right? And so that's number one. But number two, and this is almost more important, right? Is that, okay, there's us the consumers, and we're always obsessed with us the consumers. Of course, e-commerce is going to win out because I do all my shopping there. Everyone I know does all their shopping there, right? Everyone gets Amazon boxes on their porches. Well, I tend to go with the assumption that nothing is going to last very long if people can't figure out a way to make money doing it. And the reality, and again, this might be surprising, is that no one has really discovered how to make money selling online. Right? If you really get into the costs involved in selling online, they are enormous. I'll give you one data point. Amazon, we all know Amazon, right? Amazon, in its best quarters, barely turns a profit on e-commerce. Almost all of its profit historically has been from its cloud computing division, Amazon Web Services. Now, that's probably going to change, or presumably will change with its major investment in AI, but the profit has never been from the e-commerce. And this is Amazon. They've now had 30 years to achieve economies of scale. And they're still barely eking out a profit, even in their best quarters on e-commerce. That should tell you something, right? So there's the cost of online selling, and what's become clear over the last 10 years is that retailers cannot make money without stores, right? And that's resulted in a bit of revisionism about the assumption last decade, which was that we're never going to need stores again, right? That clearly is not the case. And so, that's point number one about this. That not only is there a ceiling to what we'll buy online, but businesses have to make money selling online. And they can't make money selling purely online. So what a lot of them have started to do, a lot of retailers that began online, that were digitally native, they started to open stores, right? The one that gets the most attention and has been arguably the most successful is Warby Parker, right? But most of the names from last decade that emerged in this digitally native era, right?
Just make sure
that's right, sorry. Have started opening stores in real life, right? In fact, Amazon started to do it too. The thing was, they weren't very good at it. It's kind of ironic if you take the history of Amazon pretty much destroying the bookseller industry, then destroying Barnes & Noble, then starting to open their own bookstores, then not being very good at it, then closing their bookstores, and now Barnes & Noble is expanding. In fact, the number of independent booksellers has actually gone up every year since 2010. So it's not just Barnes & Noble. So, again, the way these things work out is not always what we expected from the outset. But my point is that Amazon started opening stores. They just weren't very good at it. So they shut them all, except for Whole Foods, which they still own, and Amazon Fresh, which is this other grocery concept they've been rolling out, not to much success thus far. Even Wayfair, which was for the longest time a holdout. They're like, no, we aren't opening stores. We're just not doing it, right? Well, they started opening stores in old department stores. First one was outside of Chicago. They're now opening a few others. So they've gotten the idea, right? And the reason is because there's synergies between these two channels. Both online and in-store do better when they're working together. right? You need both. You can't be just brick and mortar, but you can't just be online, right? And I say this because it has a lot of ramifications for what we're doing here and the demand for retail space. Now, you also probably remember near the end of the last decade, before the pandemic, there were lots of chains that were closing stores. It was the so-called retail apocalypse, right? You probably heard that. I heard it like so many times, it was just like fingernails on chalkboard, right? Retail apocalypse. If you actually dug deeper, there were stories behind those retailers that were closing stores. I'll call them, for the purposes of simplicity, the legacy brands. A lot of them were retailers that most everyone in this room, me included, grew up with, right? And we kind of assumed as fixed points in the universe, right? They're just part of the scenery. They're never going anywhere. Well, then they started to hit hard times, right? And if you really look at each of those cases, a lot of it boiled down to not e-commerce because there was nothing stopping the Gap or Macy's from doing e-commerce. Good retailers can walk and chew gum at the same time, right? Rather, they were doomed by a lot of self-inflicted wounds, a lot of funny money. Private equity had a huge role in most of these bankruptcies, and just the fact that, as always with retail, there's going to be better mousetraps. Why go to Macy's when you can go to TJ Maxx, get the same brands for what, 50% off? Or go to an outlet mall, for that matter, right? So this was not some retail apocalypse. This was a changing of the guard, because what happened at the same time was that there was this emergence of all this new brand of retailer. A lot of them were digitally native, but not all of them, right? That had become very popular among younger shoppers, millennials in particular, right? Again, a lot of them were digitally native, but then went clicks and bricks, started opening stores, right? And to them, this notion of a retail apocalypse really kind of was a bit of a head scratcher. Like Gap? Gap has not been a relevant brand for decades. Same with Macy's, right? Meanwhile, there were retailers that were opening that they were really drawn to. So there's a generational aspect to this, to that whole narrative of retail apocalypse. It was a changing of the guard. And to be honest, an appropriate one, right? So when you take all of that, right, and you look right now, and again, these are national numbers. You kind of take them a little bit with a grain of salt, but we're at 4.3% retail vacancy nationwide. That is very low. That's lower than it's been in a long time, right? There's been some slowdown in leasing over the last 6 to 9 months for obvious reasons, a lot of uncertainty in the economy, but still, the market is pretty tight, especially if you're a retailer searching for modern space in an affluent submarket like the main line, right? And what's more is that not only is space tight, there's not new inventory coming, right? Okay, here and there, you're getting 10,000 square feet, 30,000 square feet. There are very few 800,000 square foot malls being built these days, right? So we're not going to be rescued by new supply. It's going to remain tight, right? Philadelphia Metro is even better, 4.2%, and I would guess, not knowing, that the main line is probably even lower. I wouldn't be surprised if it was between 3 and 4%. This is very low. You wouldn't even want it to be much lower. You want some ability for churn, right? So, despite what you hear, retail is arguably the healthiest property type right now, which is kind of amazing to say 5 years after the pandemic. Right? When even I didn't know, how is this sector going to survive? Right? So that's the macro. But retail, yes, go ahead.
What's the percentage vacancy in Radnor right now?
Do we have that data yet?
We don't have that yet.
Yeah, we're...
Can you reiterate the question for the...
Yeah, I'm sorry. So the question was, so what is the vacancy rate in Radnor in Wayne right now? And that's data that we are gathering. And I should have said up front, I'm still very much at the early stages of my work on this project. For one thing, I haven't talked to anyone. You guys are the first ones, other than Steve, from Radnor, that I have talked to as part of this, right? So, today is not necessarily going to be about me able to say anything all that authoritatively about Radnor, but more generally about retail and how it's going and what that says for Radnor, right? But yeah, we are going to gather that. We just haven't yet. So all of that's great, right? But retail happens in the micro. That means that, 4.3% nationally, that's great. What does it mean for Radnor? Well, the reality is that conditions and prospects for different kinds of retail districts vary very widely. In the last 5 years, it was big city downtowns that took the biggest hit, right? And you saw some of that in Center City. Although Center City is actually recovered better than a lot of others of its peers. But conditions and prospects vary widely, right? So just because it's 4.3% nationally doesn't necessarily mean it's all going to be great for your district, right? Because let's think about it. You used to have these large brands, whether Gap or what have you, with over 1,000 stores nationwide, right? These digitally native brands have started expanding. They've started opening stores too, but who says they're going to need 1,000? Probably won't. So that means there's going to be winners and losers, right? And in order to figure out who's going to be the winners and who's going to be the losers, you can't just think of districts in a vacuum. You have to think of them as part of an ecology, right? So we've got downtown Wayne, right? We also have downtown Bryn Mawr. We have downtown Ardmore, right? We have downtown Media. We have Suburban Square, right? We have, of course, that mall to the north, right? There's an ecology of retail, and they're all of these different districts or centers, they compete with each other, right? And some will wind up on top, some won't. Some will wind up on top for certain things, others will wind on top for others. But they'll all have their role, and that role is always evolving, right? And that's what we really need to understand here. That's the most important part of this, is where does downtown Wayne fit in that ecology, now and potentially in the future? So before I talk a little bit about that, let me just do a couple of mental shifts which are important for you to do in order to think retail. Thank you. In retail, we always think about the consumer, us, right? We say, oh, okay, there's lots of consumers like me that want to buy books. So that means there must be enough demand to support a bookstore. And that might well be true. I mean, it probably is. You have a bookstore in Wayne. But that's not the only market we have to think about. There's that market, consumers demanding goods and services from retailers. But then there's another market where tenants, retail tenants, seek space from property owners. And the two aren't necessarily the same. They're related in some ways, but you could have a downtown where there's more than enough consumers to support the kind of retail you might like, and yet this second market isn't working for one reason or another. And that's why you're not seeing that retail, right? And most people, and again, this is natural, they think only in terms of that first market, whereas it's that second market which is really the more critical one, especially in the main line. Let's be honest, there's no problem with demand in this part of the world, right? There's enough demand to support pretty much anything you want. It's a question of the retailers that can give it to you, where do they want to be? In this ecology, how does downtown Wayne match up, right? And that's kind of a different, it requires a shift. Another way to think about this, and sorry if I'm being redundant here, is that you can't think of downtown Wayne in a vacuum, right? You have to think about it versus your competition, right? Think about when you get up in the morning, you say, okay, today I have to shop. You might not be happy about it. You consider the different places you can shop. Do they have what I want? Is the parking going to be a pain? X, Y, and Z, right? Well, there's another process going on with the tenant, right? They're saying, okay, I want to be in this part of the world. Where should I be? Okay, yeah, there's downtown Wayne, but then this downtown actually, they have more of this, which I want, or they have less of that, which I don't want. right? They're making that calculation as well. It's a comparison game. I know it's very intuitive, or it's like almost a reflex where you think of downtown when you're saying, okay, we meet all the criteria to have the retail that we want. But it's not about whether you meet the criteria. It's about whether you not only meet the criteria, but you exceed your competitors. What is that, the old saying, like, if you're getting chased by a bear,
You don't have to be fast, you just have to be faster than your friend.
exactly. And that's what retail is. It's a comparison game. And again, that takes a mental shift as well. Okay. So just a few nuances here, which probably, aren't intuitive to you, because they certainly weren't to me before I started doing this stuff. There's a particular type of shopping called comparison shopping, right? And comparison shopping it's when you're shopping for goods where you like to compare different options, different styles, different levels of quality, different prices, right? Clothing, right? Shoes, furniture, home accents. In that case, what you gravitate to, generally speaking, what consumers gravitate to is where that selection is greatest, where you have the most options, right? And so what that means is that you want to be in a retail district or center where there's lots of stores selling these things, so you can do that comparison. So that gives an advantage from the outset to the bigger competitors, right? So that's number one, and you'll see some of the implications of this in a moment. There's also something called co-tenancy in retail. If you overhear brokers talk, they will use this word incessantly, right? Basically what it means is retailers are risk averse in general, right? And they're pack animals, right? And so what they tend to do is they tend to follow each other. And you've probably seen examples of this. They tend to follow each other. They tend to follow even their competitors. In fact, they'd often rather be close to their competitors in this large sort of agglomeration of retail than on their own, when they would seem to be the only choice, right? And that's because they know that you want that. You want that large agglomeration of retail. So they need to be there, right? So retailers will look very closely when they're deciding whether to locate in a particular main street about the other retailers that are already there. Because here's the thinking, like, okay, I'm a retailer, I might suck at this, right? But at the very least, if I'm in a downtown where there are other retailers like me, no matter how bad I am at this, I can at least be sure that I'll be able to get visibility and cross-traffic from those other retailers. It's a risk-averse strategy, right? They're hedging their bets, right? So that is what co-tenancy basically is. It's a safety in numbers approach. And that little cartoon on the right, it refers to a well-known saying about retailers. Retailers are like lemmings. They will follow each other off a cliff. So the lure of co-tenancy is absolutely critical to all of this, right? Especially with large brands, but not only with them, right? Even independently owned retailers will think this way, right? There's safety in numbers. Okay, then there's another phrase which brokers will use constantly. I don't really think they actually know what it means in the sense of being able to define it, right? This notion of critical mass, that at some point the retailers, there are enough of them, there's that once you reach that threshold, it just takes off, right? Let's say you're a clothing store and there's 10 clothing stores in a particular mall, and that 11th one, you don't just get another 10%, you get another 30% in customer volumes, right? It just takes off. And that's what critical mass means in physics. And some smarter than average broker actually took that concept and applied it to retail, right? So you'll hear brokers all the time say like, yeah, I was looking at that space on behalf of my retailer clients. That downtown just didn't have critical mass, right? Now, Suburban Square, that has critical mass, you know. It's basically the idea that this is, you know, something critical mass isn't just where you go for a particular store. It's where you go for a certain kind of store, because there's so many of them there. You can just choose once you're there, right? So there's no critical mass. And then the last part of this is the pull of gravity. Gravitational pull of bigger districts and centers, right? So it's this whole, again, it's kind of amazing when retail actually tries to use science, because it's not a very intellectual field, but there's this law of there's this theory of gravitational pull that was discovered in the 30s by some University of Texas business school professor, which basically says if there are two malls on either side of me, and they're the same size, and I'm in the middle, right? Let's say one of them adds another 200,000 square feet. Then, even if I move slightly further away from them, I'm closer to the smaller one, I will still be lured by gravity to the bigger mall that just made that expansion. Right? And there, in a nutshell, is why King of Prussia is so big. Because bigger just gets better over time. Because of everything I just said, right? Because of you wanting that selection, because of retailers being pack animals, right? There is such a gravitational pull to what's already well established and large. It's very hard. It's very hard to start from scratch when you're up against that. Or historically, it's been very hard. It's a little less so now in ways that I'll describe. Okay, so those are some concepts. I hope they make some sense. They probably will become clearer as I talk more about this. The last one I'll mention is spacing, right? And this applies a little more to brands that have multiple stores, right? There's part of how they think about this, which is about the spacing of their locations. They always want them to be far enough apart so that they're not cannibalizing each other. So if you have a retailer that has a store, say in downtown Bryn Mawr, a lot of retailers will say, yeah, I can't open in Wayne, that's too close. The point, I'll just be stealing sales from myself. I got to go a little further west, or I got to go a little further north. There's a spacing consideration. Now, the tricky part about this is that different retailers have different spacing requirements. If you look at Kurnu Zabet, right, that's in Bryn Mawr Village, they have 7 locations nationwide. That's their only one in Philadelphia. Chances are they're not opening another, no matter how far away it is. It can be in Cherry Hill. They're probably not opening a second one, right? Whereas Blue Mercury, they have stores in Ardmore, in Bryn Mawr, and here. So their spacing doesn't need to be as extensive, right? So that's an important part of this as well. Now, of course, there's so much affluence here in such a relatively high density. The spacing doesn't need to be as far apart as it probably does in other places. And that's why you have 3 Blue Mercuries all pretty close to each other in relative terms. Right? But still, that is a constraint. Okay, so what does this mean? Well, you're probably saying, okay, we're not going to be King of Prussia. We're not going to be Suburban Square, right? We're not the ones that are going to have that gravitational pull. And that's probably true. You're not going to be able to compete head-on with those competitors. They're just too formidable, right? But there are alternatives to that. Alternatives that can leave you with a very healthy and successful downtown. In fact, relatively speaking, this is a very healthy and successful downtown. I know you see a lot of blemishes, and every downtown has some blemishes, but even relatively speaking, all the other downtowns on the main line, it's a very healthy and successful one, right? So, so what's interesting is that up until the 90s, from the 50s to the 90s, if you weren't going to be King of Prussia or Suburban Square, you were kind of screwed, right? Because so much of the retail was concentrated in shopping centers like that. Well, an interesting thing happened in the 90s. A number of interesting things. The first thing that was interesting from the point of view of downtowns is that they finally happened on a formula that could work. We spent a lot of time in downtowns trying to emulate the shopping center. Think of Center City. What was the Galleria? Galleria was an attempt to bring a suburban model into an urban setting. Right? That was what we did in the 70s and the 80s. Even the whole experiment with pedestrian malls. Right? That was an attempt to use the same concepts that undergirded the design of the regional mall, right, in a downtown setting. Right? In the 90s, we finally said, that's not working. We got to try something different. And we found a formula which could work, which could enable downtowns to coexist with malls. Right? It was a successful adaptation, and in the end, it really did lead to a renaissance of downtowns and main streets over the last 30 years, which really continued almost up to March 2020. Right? And what's great about this formula, which I'll describe in a minute, is that it also turns out to be quite effective against the online threat. Because basically, you don't want to compete with either the shopping center or e-commerce on its own terms. You're not going to win. Right? What you can do is double down on what makes downtowns and main streets distinctive and differentiated. And that shopping center and e-commerce cannot effectively compete against. Right? So if we look at some of what that meant in terms of retail mix, for the most part, it was more of a focus on what I call browse-worthy boutiques and small chainlets, right? So first of all, it was going to be more of an emphasis on the smaller operators rather than large brands, right? And when I say chainlets, I'm really talking about retailers that have, 2 to 9 locations, right? They don't feel ubiquitous, right? And when I say browse-worthy, what I mean is that if you think of King of Prussia, the whole point is the selection. You got every brand there that you'd ever want, right? Or even if you think of online, the infinite aisle. You got every brand, every product you could ever hope for, right? We're not going to try to do that in a downtown. We're going to just make it browse-worthy. We're going to make it a place where you go for an afternoon, right? You maybe go for lunch. You do some window shopping. You maybe go into some of those shops. You browse. You might buy. Then you stop for a coffee. Then maybe you walk a little more. Browse-worthy. It doesn't have to be all things to all people, right? It just has to be interesting, right? It just has to be, compelling for an afternoon. Or for an afternoon and evening, right? So that started to show success, and the reason that it worked is partly because these sorts of tenants, these boutiques and smaller chainlets, they aren't willing, nor necessarily are they able to sustain the sorts of rents and occupancy costs that, say, a suburban square location would demand. And furthermore, the owner of a shopping center like that is going to require a certain level of what's known as creditworthiness or a certain credit risk. They're going to want greater certainty that this retailer is going to last and going to pay their rent through the term of the lease, right? That usually means larger brands, right? So that's why these sorts of retailers would gravitate to and be welcomed in and able to pay the costs of these sorts of downtown and main street locations. Right? So that was the first part of the formula. The second part of the formula was differentiated food and beverage concepts. In the 90s, all your malls, and even to some degree today, had food and beverage concepts that were pretty generic. Right? That started to change a little bit, although not as much as I would have expected at King of Prussia. Right? differentiated food and beverage concepts, maybe chef-driven, but just in general, different, often independently owned, right? And this is, and there's another reason why this started to happen, okay? These millennials, they were pretty influential in consumer culture. And one thing that they did is they kind of changed our notion of what can drive revitalization and transformation. The general assumption was always, when I was growing up, and undoubtedly when you were too, that it's art. The artists, they're going to start things, right? That's what they did in Soho. You know, the artists moved into those lofts, right? And the rest is history. That's the way to do it, right? Well, millennials didn't really go too far away from that, but they changed or they expanded who those artists were. Now, millennials, grown up on the Food Network, they saw chefs as artists. They saw baristas as artists. They saw brewmakers as artists, right? And so slowly but surely, the art form became not your traditional visual art. It became food and beverage, right? It's still called artisanal. So, you know, there's a through line there. It's not a break, but it is a clear evolution, right? And so that's why food and beverage started to become so central to our consumer culture, to the point where just before the pandemic, we were actually spending more money dining out than we were at the grocery store. Which never happened. That was driven by millennials. Why am I talking about millennials? There's probably no millennials in this room. Well, because everyone's moving to places like Wayne, right? And they're certainly going to be the ones who are buying your houses if you're putting them up for sale, right? And so that was the other important part of the urban renaissance. And when I say urban, I mean downtowns and main streets, right? Was differentiated food and beverage. Okay. There are a couple of other retail anchors which people talk about for this new kind of distinctive downtown that I call it. Public gathering spaces, right? If you look at certain downtowns and main streets, some of them, the real anchor, it's no longer, if you're a city, a department store, or if you're a suburban downtown, a variety store, it's now maybe a park or a setting, right? Now, what's tricky about this is that these are people who are coming for the park or the setting. They're not necessarily coming to spend money, right? One of the things that department stores were so good at with malls is that, hey, we know they're coming to shop at the department store, right? To spend money on clothing. So you kind of knew this was a target-rich environment if you were one of those smaller retailers. Now, you don't know if people who are coming to your park or to your waterfront have any interest in consuming, right? So it's not as target-rich. So, you know, there's that caveat. You got to find ways, and I hate this word, but you got to find ways to monetize those people for the benefit of your businesses, right? Which is sometimes easier said than done. Housing within walking distance, right? That's another one which is often thrown out there as the key to our salvation. And no doubt, it's a positive. But we shouldn't get ahead of ourselves. The apartments at Wayne Station are going to have, what, 24 units? That's going to be, what, about 50 people? A drop in the bucket when it comes to consumer demand. Ultimately, almost all downtowns, but especially suburban ones, they rise and fall based on the extent to which they can draw people from beyond. Right? They can't just survive on the basis of people within walking distance. In fact, few cities can even survive on the basis of people within walking distance, right? You need a lot of people to support tens or hundreds of thousands of square feet of retail space, right? So I think it's a great thing, and there are other reasons why it's a great thing besides consumer demand. But I don't think we should overestimate what impact that's going to have on retail sales. Okay, so last thing I want to say about this distinctive downtown, and it's like what I just said, it needs to be positioned as a destination, right? And there's a variety of reasons for that, another of which is parking, which I'll say more about right now. I know it's a very loaded subject. We have a separate consultant. That's all she's doing on this. So I am not going to steal her thunder, and I am looking at it through a very narrow lens of retail. So with those qualifications put out there, what I will say is that when I say position as a destination, what I am primarily talking about are those categories that I just mentioned, right? The browse-worthy retail, the differentiated food and beverage. I'm not necessarily talking about what one might call general everyday shopping. Because that's known, remember I talked about comparison shopping? Well, there's something also called convenience shopping. These are the goods and services where we buy on the basis of what's most convenient. We are not driving 10 miles away for a CVS when there's one around the corner. Because they're all the same. They're interchangeable. So you're going to choose which store you go to for your dry cleaning, for your over-the-counter medication, your prescription and over-the-counter medication. You're going to base that on convenience, right? Even for your groceries, although that's changing a little bit, that's historically been considered a convenience good or service, right? So what does convenience mean? Especially in a suburban setting, usually means a car, right? And cars have needs, which are more easily accommodated on a Lancaster Avenue than on a North Wayne Avenue, right? So there is kind of a bias, at least on North Wayne Avenue. There's a bias with these convenience-oriented uses towards Lancaster Avenue, and also in the shadow of supermarket anchors, because supermarkets are the big 800-pound gorilla of convenience retail, right? All the other kinds of convenience-oriented businesses want to be near the grocery store, because you all go grocery shopping at least once a week. It's regular, it's reliable, so all these smaller convenience-oriented businesses, they want to be near that supermarket, right? That's the bias for conveniences, right? That might be a little disappointing to some of you because we didn't used to be this way, right? But in this auto-oriented world we're in, a true downtown or main street setting is not ideal for conveniences. Right? Okay, so last point I'll make about parking. Parking is something we always think about on its own terms, right? But I've always felt that it's contingent on something else. Right? We will tolerate quite a bit of hassle, quite a bit of inconvenience. We might even pay for a space at a destination that we really covet. There's this grocery store called Trader Joe's. You might have heard of it. Notorious in the industry for underparked stores, right? We all know what this is like, circling the parking lot forever. Well, they're pretty cynical about it. They're a notoriously secretive retailer. You don't get much from them. But we do know this. Their attitude is like, we're Trader Joe's, they'll figure out a way. And as obnoxious as that sounds, it's true, right? Now, there's stakes. If they start being not as popular, they are really screwed, right? But they are popular. And it's the same thing with parking, right? If it's a destination you are craving for whatever reason, you will find a way to park. You won't be happy about it. You won't like walking from 2 blocks away. You won't like feeding a meter. You won't like circling, but you'll do it. So I always wonder, and this is not always the case, but I always wonder whether if people feel there's a parking problem, is it obscuring something deeper? I was working in Northern Liberties, and there was a restaurateur who'd been there for like 20, 30 years. And he was complaining to me, he said, I don't get it. You know, people just, they're not coming anymore. They're saying the parking is just miserable. And what I thought, I didn't necessarily say this to him directly, but well, the parking has never been good here. Maybe it's because your business just isn't worth it anymore. You haven't innovated, you haven't changed, you haven't done a thing, right? Now, this is not always the case. Sometimes, and Wayne might be one of these, parking is very tight, right? But there is also the possibility that, when you have frictions like that, and not just parking, but other sorts of frictions, congestion is another one, high prices, you also have to wonder whether the complaints are actually rooted in something deeper or are a symptom of something deeper, right? That maybe for your customers, the juice just ain't worth the squeeze anymore. Right? So anyway, that's all I'll say about parking. Okay, a few last thoughts. And you might already be aware of this book because it was basically written about Wayne. It also happened to be transformational in the understanding of retail, right? David Brooks' Bobo's in Paradise, which focused on Wayne. This was written a good 25 years ago. But its basic underlying concept was that retail is not just about numbers, right? Someone who makes $150,000 a year, put them next to someone else making $150,000 a year, that doesn't really have much predictive value in terms of where they're going to shop. There are other variables which dictate that, right? Lifestyles, their sensibilities, their aspirations, a lot of soft stuff which is very hard to measure, very hard to quantify, but we know is really important to all of this. And buried within it is this notion that retail is also about how we see ourselves and how we want to be seen by others. That's one of the other things I find so fascinating about it. It's such a psychological thing. Right? And what's even more tricky about psychographics, and this is what they're called as opposed to demographics, is that they're constantly evolving. Right? 25 years ago, you did not have athleisure. That word did not exist. We didn't know something called Lululemon, let alone Athleta and Alo and the 7,000 other yoga wear purveyors, right? Philly bloke. I mean, this is, growing up, this is just mind-boggling that, guys care where they get their hair cut. I mean, maybe I'm a little biased. They don't have much to cut.
You look at me when you said that.
But, this is how things have changed. And that was that was Brooks' fundamental idea, is that we have to understand these things to understand how people make the choices that they do in retail, right? And then layered on top of it is something that's happened more recently, starting last decade and accelerating during the pandemic. It's something I call the suburbanization of hip. I grew up in a small Hudson River town in Westchester County, New York, not Westchester in Pennsylvania, a very sleepy little place. It was a railroad suburb, and so it was really cute and quaint and a real yawner, right? Now, I go back there. It has 3 of the best coffee houses I have ever actually had coffee at. It has all these great restaurants. I'm like, where did this come from? And where it came from is, again, a lot of these millennials, they grew up, right? They grew up, they started families, and you know what? Shocking as it might be to a lot of planners, they wanted the same thing everyone else did, right? They wanted a house in the suburbs, they wanted a good school system, but they also wanted to take a little bit of urbanity with them, right? They didn't want to leave that whole hog. And that's what we've seen in the last 15 years in suburban communities across the United States, right? You see people like the one on the upper right. I mean, tattoos in suburbs, right? Goat's Beard. They opened a second location here, right? 2016, right? They were following their customer. David Brooks looking at downtown Wayne in 2001, do you think there had been a retailer that advertised themselves for the girl next door, it girl? Right? This is all rooted in an urban experience, which a lot of these millennials had. Right? And what's more is that this isn't just millennials anymore. This stuff has pervaded the mass market. Right? Think about the rise of craft beer. Now it's starting to go in the other direction. It's hit market saturation. But it was up and up and up for a long time. It was more than just a fringe taste. Got to, I think, 13% market share. That's not just a fringe urban taste, right? Same with artisanal coffee. Right? As everything, it went from hip to trendy to mass, right? So all of us are in on this. All of us, our sensibilities have changed, right? Okay, so a last few slides about some of the things we have to worry about going forward. Well, this generational change has a lot of aspects to it. Most notably, Gen Z, the Zoomers, the ones who came after millennials, the ones who are kind of in their early to mid-20s right now, they're not drinking. Millennials drank a ton. If you look at that chart on the right, right? And then you look at Zoomers, they're lower in every type of alcohol, and especially beer, 31 to 19, right? That's a huge change, and that has potentially massive implications for the entire food and beverage sector. Because how many restaurants really make their money on alcohol, right? Generational change, millennials, they no longer need the accoutrements of fine dining. They don't have to have waiters and waitresses. They don't need reservations. They'll wait on lines for things. They don't need a valet. They'll even go into a restaurant and order at the counter as if it's like traditional fast food. And that's why we had the rise of what's called fast casual, the Sweetgreens of the world, which are definitely a cut above McDonald's and Burger King, but still a counter service model. And yet, fast casual, and you see this in food halls all the time, can be considered high quality dining by millennials. That's a huge change, right? My parents still won't go to a restaurant that doesn't take reservations, right? So generational change. Unclear future, not only about alcohol, but what's gonna happen with movie theaters? Okay, they're hanging on, they made some adaptations. I do not count them out because they've been counted out so many times since the 1950s. But again, it's some strong headwinds. And then an unbalanced retail mix. And this doesn't seem to exist right now in Wayne, although it sounds like there's the feeling that it does, that what you can have with this food and beverage focus sometimes is a little too much food and beverage, which at least when alcohol is king, tends to drive rents upward and crowd out a lot of shopping. That's happened in a lot of downtowns in the last 30 years. That's not good either, right? So there's always that threat of an unbalanced retail mix. Rising competition, and the reason, so the rising competition in that other downtowns are obviously building new mixed-use projects with retail space. That's competing for tenants, right? But then you also have the faux downtowns that have been developed increasingly in the last 15 years. King of Prussia Town Center, for instance, it's a faux downtown. They want to kind of, it's kind of a scratch-made downtown, put the ingredients in and stir. And for a lot of people, that's enough, right? Not everyone, certainly not for me, probably not for a lot of people in this room. But for a lot of people, it's enough, right? And the reason I put that here is not only is it like mimicking the urban form, right? It's also getting more interesting tenants, right? It's not just a P.F. Chang's, it's Polydor, right? It's more of these sorts of chef-driven independent retail restaurants that I was saying that's supposed to be downtowns, bailiwick, right? That's our ace in the hole. So I think what this means is that downtowns and matrix have to stay ahead of the curve. They got to keep innovating. I'm giving a walking tour tomorrow of Chelsea Market in New York City for Columbia University graduate school class. And, Chelsea Market's been there now since 1997. And I walked through today and I'm like, these tourists come here. I wonder if they think, so? Every city has a Chelsea Market now. It's not that unusual. It's not that novel, right? It was one of the first of its kind 28 years ago. But these things have to iterate, right? Downtown and main streets, these things have to iterate, in particular, because we don't have convenience on our side. Right? So that's always something to be concerned about. This is another one, category contraction. You've probably read quite a bit about this because Rite Aid's based in Massachusetts, but there are a bunch of retail categories, more convenience-oriented, that we've historically relied upon to eat up enormous quantities of retail space. that are all severely contracting now, right? Large format drugstores, it wasn't that long ago when everyone was like, why is there one in every corner? Well, now they're all closing. Rite Aid is no more. CVS and Walgreens are closing hundreds of stores. Bank branches, they're not necessarily closing, but they're shrinking, right? And of course, cell phone purveyors, right? This leaves a hole, right? And probably on the main line, that's not going to be a problem backfilling, but it is a change, right? And especially when you're talking 12,000 square foot drugstores. I know Ballard Designs is taking the gap space. It's an example that these spaces, they don't just sit empty here. The market's so tight, someone comes along pretty quickly. But still, 12,000, 50,000 square foot spaces, not easy ones to backfill in general, right? So, category contraction. All right. Lastly, I just want to say, or maybe kind of channel what might be going through your head. Great, that was interesting. So what can we do about it? I mean, that's an hour of my life I'm not getting back. Well, the whole idea here is that there are things you can do about it. Now, let's be clear. Landlords and brokers lease retail space, not townships, not nonprofits. Well, sometimes they do, but rarely, right? This is not something that we have direct control over. The final decisions do not necessarily rest with us. So, but there are a lot of other ways that townships can be more proactive. They don't just have to be a passive player in all of this, right? And this can range. It can be as simple as serving as a really robust information clearinghouse. What's the vacancy rate, for instance? What's the foot traffic? How is that changing? We now have new technologies that actually gather that data from cell phones anonymously, right? This retail vision that we're putting together, obviously no landlord or broker has to pay any attention to it. They are under no obligation to do so, right? But maybe they'll find it interesting, right? Maybe they'll say, there was some research behind this. There's some reference to other analogous downtowns across the country. Maybe these are tenants worth considering or pursuing, right? Incentives for what we want to see, right? Maybe if you want to make sure that's a balanced mix, we offer incentives to the tenants that we want to make sure we preserve opportunity for, right? Creating leasing collateral, basically a brochure which tells the story of downtown Wayne. You got to understand, when brokers market spaces, what they're often primarily trying to pitch is a space. One space. They are not necessarily selling Wayne. You might say, why do we have to sell Wayne? Well, in certain respects, you're right. It does sell itself, but this is a way of steering that narrative, maybe towards the kinds of tenants that you want, and making arguments that will resonate with them specifically. Right? And then finally, there are some public nonprofit sector entities that actually help with prospecting and vetting leads that they then relay to landlords and brokers. Say, hey, you don't have to pay any attention to these, but we came up with 10 retailers that, we've done some filtering. We know that they have a solid track record, and they really fit where we think this downtown can go. You're under no obligation to look at them, but, you have a few minutes, give it a gander. So there are things that Radnor can do, and these are what we're going to be exploring as part of this. So last slide is just a little bit about what's coming next. Obviously, I'm only at the beginning of this. When I have total immersion here, I like, as a retail consultant, to spend a lot of time on site. So you probably will be seeing me quite a bit. I don't feel you can understand this stuff without being on the ground, especially with the psychographic dimension. I'll be here on Saturday for the open house. We're going to be doing focus groups with merchants and talking with developers and landlords and brokers and people at the township, looking at national analogs. And the whole idea is to say, okay, this is what's possible here, right? This downtown, it's a strange assignment for me because I'm usually called into downtowns that are struggling with something. This downtown, yes, again, I'm sure it has its challenges and blemishes. This is, again, a healthy and successful downtown, relatively speaking, right? But then again, I often work in communities like these because they are who they are because they've thought ahead, right? And they've said, we have to be thinking about this 10 years from now, where the puck is headed, right? And that's what we'll be doing here, is where is the puck headed and how can we steer it in the direction we want? And what tools exist for that? And who is the one who's actually going to do it? Who's the one best suited to do it? So on and so forth. So that's what we have, and I'm looking forward to all of this. And yeah, that's it.
Yeah, we're great. Do we have the microphone, Steve, for people? While we're waiting for Steve, yeah, give me 1 second. Just a reminder, if you haven't heard about it, if it hasn't been posted, on December 8th, Mike is going to be coming to the Board of Commissioners meeting to present like initial findings from that work. So like there were some questions here. We're not going to be able to answer any questions now on like what is happening in Wayne right now. So I'd like to really kind of get questions about like this presentation that you just heard, you know, clarifications, information like that. So Steve, do you want to? And while Steve's walking over there, as a millennial, you're welcome. You're all very welcome. There are a couple of us in the audience, yeah, on the 80s,
Very
right?
healthy self-concept, just like all
Yeah, you're
millennials,
welcome.
right?
That's it.
A lot of us boomers say that to you.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
I just have one question about a trend that I've noticed in the past 30 years. Maybe it's not technically retail, but in storefronts, when you have activities,
Yeah.
like Color Me Mine, the Christine Shirley sewing, which seems to be quite successful, the mainline baseball. And I think it also fills in a gap, like we don't have the roller rink anymore, things for the families to do. So I'm just wondering about that. Is that part of this plan?
Yes, it is. That's a very good question because that has been a clear trend that there needs to be something more than the transactional in retail spaces now. There's got to be some activity or either that you get to do or you observe others doing, right, that makes into something more, right? We need that because if all we're doing is a transaction, that's easily done elsewhere, as we know, right? You know, it's been called experiential retail. You know, as a retail nerd, I struggle with that word because I always feel like good retail's always been experiential. I think of the old departments. I mean, the old Strawbridge, that was experiential, right? You know, retail is experiential. Maybe they're not doing something right, you know. But yes, that has definitely been a trend. The tricky part about it is to figure out which of those actually contribute to the surviving and thriving in the business. Not all do, right? And, you know, and this is like a lot of things in retail, there's a lot of kind of just passing off of lazy assumptions, you know, without much research actually done on, does this actually make people spend more, right? And so I think that's the nuance of it. But yes, that is very much what retailers are trying to do today and what tenant mixes are increasingly incorporating. Like even just in Bryn Mawr, I see they're opening a Blue Sky Pottery. You know, another example. You know, it's not open yet, but like, you know, it's going to be like a pottery studio, like that. Yeah.
Thank you. This is great. Appreciate it. You talked a lot about King of Prussia and Suburban Square. Those two locations, right, are owned by national REITs, right, with a broad team of merchandising professionals and people that do demographics, that understand merchandising, have bigger pockets, and are all leasing space for a singular goal, right?
Yeah.
Both to manage food and beverage amounts and small shops and anchors, and they understand the business. It's a science and an art. How are we, you, the township, going to convince 20 or 30 or in the broader market, 50 different owners to all work towards the same goals. Because those goals are different, right?
Yeah.
They don't have TI dollars to give to tenants. They don't want to invest in a kitchen or a restaurant, right? Building out a 6,000 square foot restaurant could be $2 million. So in other downtowns, without a bid or an improvement district or an economic development group, how are we convincing each of the owners to work together?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And do I need to repeat it, or is it?
No, you
No,
got it
I
on
think
the
I
mic.
think he's got it on the mic.
It's
Yeah, yeah. No, it's an excellent question, and that's the meat of it. Because if that's basically why I have a job, because most of my work, not all, but most of it is in these sorts of districts where you have multiple property owners, you have multiple stakeholders, and you have to the extent possible, get them somehow to cohere around a broader vision. What I will say is you are not going to get buy-in from anywhere close to 50. What I'll also say is that you don't necessarily need to, at least at first. Because, just like that whole critical mass concept, there's also kind of a critical mass of momentum, which you can jumpstart, and then it can start to take off, right? And so trying to manipulate that process is part of this.
Can I jump in on?
Yeah, and I'll just say one other thing is that it's true that you've got let's say you have 50 property owners all with different interests. There are some that do, at least theoretically, have the incentive to think a little more broadly. Like if you say you have a large portfolio of retail space, maybe it makes sense to consider a loss leader, right? Maybe, or if you're a university and you have a different mission, right? Now, a lot of universities don't always see that, but some do. Some have. Penn is one of them. So, trying to figure out who strategically makes the most sense to engage from the outset so as to get that ball rolling. It's a very imperfect and can be very frustrating process. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, a couple of things. So one of the things that we can talk a little bit about this process is like, how do you successfully maintain? Like, what are the structures that you need in order to take the planning work that we're going to be doing and carry it forward? And there are models around it. I mean, one of the models you guys have already started implementing with the WBA, right? You've got an association of business owners that come together and they talk. And I know that there are, in any groups of people, there are divisions and, differences of opinions about how things are. But that's a huge step. There are a lot of downtowns that haven't done that. The other thing that I don't know if everybody's aware of, but the township is currently in the process of trying to hire an economic development person. And one of the responsibilities of that person is going to be to sort of support businesses, right? And sort of guide the direction of, businesses in the township. So we really see that as a great opportunity. There are other communities, like Media has a media business authority, where they collect, some money and they pay for somebody to help do that. That's got its advantages and disadvantages to all of it. But we do see the potential for an economic development staff person being a huge advantage coming out of this planning process, because that person, when they get hired, will have a blueprint for how to sort of move and advance things in the direction. And a lot of it is person interaction, right? You've got to develop relationships. You've got to do kind of what Mike says, bring a couple of people, right? Sometimes it's just putting the right thing in front of the right person at the right time to make it happen. Yeah, do we have the mic somewhere?
I do.
Oh, great.
I appreciate anybody who's a business owner here, because it's not an easy task. I've been a shopper in Wayne since 1965, and it's been interesting watching the change. And I've also run a company by myself. But what I wanted to say, the township, I don't know how many years ago, removed our parking meters and put in those kiosks. And I don't know of a business owner in the town who approved or appreciated that. It's been a situation of irritation to those of us who shop. And apparently it cost more than $750,000 to put them in. And they are creating advertisement. But it costs, I think, those who have businesses here a lot of goodwill. And deep-seated just unpleasant feeling towards the township for having done this. And I just wanted to make you all aware that that's something that might be looked at. Ardmore has the coin ones. If you've ever seen a mother with 2 children on their hips in a snowstorm trying to figure out the number behind their car and then stand in line at a kiosk to punch in all the various different things, which she can't see if the sun is hitting it at a certain angle. Is this what we want for our Wayne? Thank you.
I'm gonna thank you for that. I totally understand. It's genuinely, when we started with the comprehensive plan, I walked around Wayne. It was one of the first things I did. One of the first things I did is I walked into the bookstore, and one of the first things I heard was about the kiosks. I understand the concerns. I do want to really emphasize, though, if you have thoughts or concerns or issues that you want to share, please do make sure to come out on Saturday. That is really where we're going to be collecting a lot of that information. If you can't make it on Saturday and you want to share your thoughts or ideas, there is the email on the website. Drop an email to us. That works too. That's a great way to send some ideas or thoughts on the way.
I'd just like to add to that on the parking, so I'm going to do a shameless plug. The parking lot on West Avenue is going to open up on this upcoming Monday. And what you're going to notice, I spoke to Mike Maratea, he's our head of the parking authority. That lot will be license plate. There will no longer be numbers for the parking spots. It'll be like other towns. You can use your app, or you can go pay at the kiosk, and it will be by license plate. And for what Mike tells me, starting next year, Wayne and the other spaces will be converted to license plates.
Yeah,
So,
and
make
another
life a little
thing,
easier.
another plug is, when is the Board of Commissioners meeting? Is it the 17th that the parking is going to be? I believe so. Let me look at it really quickly. The 24th, excuse me. On November 24th, we're going to be doing the parking consultant is going to come in and present a whole bunch of information about what's going on with parking in Wayne. I saw a sneak preview of it today. It's interesting. There's a lot of nuance going on. Steve, do we have, oh, here.
I'm going to give it here so they
Yeah.
can just pass it on down the line, right?
Oh, thanks. Thanks. This was a great presentation. I was curious, one of the things I've noticed at Suburban Square and King of Prussia Town Center, which you alluded to in your talk, was that they have entertainers come. And I assume that those entertainers are hired by the leasing company or something like that. And you see a lot of activity kind of in the town square section. And I was curious what impact that has on the retail, if there is an impact, do you know? And if that just if that makes a difference.
Yeah, I mean, so it's like buskers, like.
No, they're hired and paid entertainers by the
like performers.
performers.
Oh, yeah.
They have
yeah,
bands
yeah.
play
Yeah, that's,
and they have, yeah,
and that, and that's usually
for free.
a established part of their marketing budgets. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a basic assumption in the retail industry, again, not one which is often supported by actual study, but which is kind of considered axiomatic, which is that the longer you get people to stay, the more they'll spend, right? So much of how these things are designed and tenanted and programmed is about extending what's called the dwell time, right? In fact, to the point where you can almost trace virtually every innovation in the mall industry to that goal. The food court, adding movie theaters, adding restaurants. It was all in the name of let's get them to stay longer, and they will spend more money. And that itself is proven. I just don't know if there's a cause and effect established systematically with every one of these changes. But even like bathrooms, which downtowns and main streets still cannot figure out, right? It's one more reason you don't have to leave, right? Phone charging stations, one more reason you don't have to leave. I've actually surprised there aren't more malls. I have seen a few that have these kind of like little man cave setups in like so that you could watch the Eagles on Sunday, you know, while the rest of your family shops. You know, anything so that you don't leave.
Somebody gave a look there. Somebody gave a look there. I'm not gonna say who around that. I do think that this is important, and you know, we're talking a lot about this within the context of retail, but I don't want everybody to forget that we are thinking about this as a downtown, right? One of the great things that Wayne has is a lot of great destinations, right? I mean, your library is spectacular. First time I walked in the library, I was like, what a great place. There are people hanging out, there are people spending time there. You've got the senior center there, right? You've got the train station. You've got a lot of reasons to go to Wayne other than the retail itself. And I do want to just recognize that, like, when we heard the comments through the comprehensive planning process, there's a lot of pride in Wayne, and people see it as not just King of Prussia Town Center, right? It is not just a shopping mall. It is a place, and it is a downtown. And I think our trick and the thing that we're gonna always be balancing here is how do we have the retail support that and all the other stuff support the retail in a way that they work together and they're sort of symbiotic. So here's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna sort of call out where the mic is gonna go so everybody doesn't have to raise their hand. Why don't we let the mic travel this way? And then it'll swing back over to that side, all right? Cool.
Me? Yeah. Hi. So I own an ice cream and coffee shop in downtown Wayne.
Okay.
The Vanilla Bean. Stop by, please. So this presentation made me think about two things. One, there was a traffic study that changed the light process. I think it's worse than it was.
At the intersection.
Yes.
At the Wayne Lincoln.
Yes, I think the traffic's gotten worse. I think it's gotten backed up longer, and that's just my opinion. I may be wrong. But I don't know if that needs to be looked at again or what have you, but just FYI. The other thought that I had was, you know, we talk about these town centers, and I've had some experience there too. I have some interest in some restaurants in Westchester and Phoenixville, and they cut off the streets.
Yeah.
And what made me think about that was, well, heck, you got a little section there. All you had to do is cut that section off. Not a huge inconvenience. You wouldn't do it in the wintertime, but you would do it in the summertime. And that would cause so much stickability to that whole area of just a common open area that people would hang out for the day, weekends. I think it would be.
So you mean like the stretch of Wayne Avenue?
North Wayne.
North Wayne Avenue.
North Wayne.
Yeah, basically from the corner to the Great American Pub.
I'm gonna keep being the kind of little bit of the stick in the mud here because it is
Yep.
8 o'clock. Please come out on Saturday.
Yeah.
Please drop us an email. And we're certainly thinking about that. I think has everybody been to Dining Under the Stars and Media, right? Like there's a lot of opportunities to talk about that. So thank you. Did somebody, yeah.
So Radnor and Wayne is also unique in that we have universities, and we have Villanova, and we have the middle school as not a university, but that has a whole different segment of population that comes out and shops, especially on Fridays. We also don't take advantage or try to attract Villanova, and we're moving a new campus in our very proximity, and see if we can capitalize on that and how it factors into the whole plan.
Wait, Villanova's getting a new campus?
Cabrini.
I'm joking. Of course I know that's how, I mean, have you watched the news? Yeah, absolutely. We're going to be thinking about all of that, right? College students.
Middle school.
Yeah, middle schoolers we all kind of like. I taught middle school. They're a pain. But college students, we're going to have to think a lot about how many of them you're going to want in your center, right? And their parents and all of that, and thinking about what that is and how, but it's certainly something that we're thinking about as a potential market and how to build those connections. Yeah.
I do want to say we are not like King of Prussia. We are not like Suburban Square. We are a small residential community with a beautiful small town. We traveled to Spring Lake a few years ago during COVID in the summer. We were enamored by Spring Lake with the number of independents, the beauty of it, the landscaping, the flora, the fauna, the beautiful just landscape. And I hope that you're not strictly thinking of retail and concrete and parking lines. I really,
Yeah, that's
Okay,
really,
but
and I
you really need to think about beauty, because I went to Haddonfield last summer, and I was struck by the beauty of the town. I want people, my husband's lived here his whole entire life. I've been here for 38 years. We love our town. We live 2 blocks from town. We want it to stay beautiful, green, and pretty. And
So-
that's really important to consumers and retail.
I get you. Come out on Saturday. Please do. And if you, this is what I don't want you to think, and I really want to emphasize, this study is not just about retail. It is not just about parking. We have brought in some very great expertise. Right. My background and my expertise is in urban design, is in placemaking. It is in understanding the relationships of all of this. So if you come out on Saturday, you're going to see all the different topics that we're trying to get at, and you're going to be able to share those thoughts and ideas. Yeah, why don't we?
One thing that is something there are studies for that shows retail sales increase with greenery. Not that that's the reason to have it, but.
So I've moved to Radnor about, 6 years ago? And I've lived all across the US, from urban to suburban locations. We've stayed because our kids went to school here. We came for the school district. We stayed because the kids loved it. We will continue to stay because this is where they've felt at home. My concern, because I have lived so many different places, is that it's very easy to think that doing things because that's how they've always been done, and that you don't think 10 years forward or 20 years forward. So I have friends who've moved here for the schools. Once the kids are done, they leave because there's really nothing to keep them here. You don't have the kind of environment where my son, who's 16, says, let's go to downtown Wayne as a family experience. I can bribe him to go to the mall. I can bribe him to go with me to the grocery store. But if I say, hey, come with me to downtown Wayne, I will bribe him with ice cream, but I won't be able to bribe him with anything else, really, because there's nothing that makes him go, yeah, this is where I can be bribed to come. And I think that's one of those things where I think when you look forward, what is that kind of thing that is keeping people and bringing them there, as you said, right? Because you're right, no one is going to come, or you can't sustain Wayne internally. It has to be brought in elsewhere.
Right.
And I think we do have a great food scene, but like, what else can we do to do that?
Yeah, absolutely. And, please come on Saturday. Please share your ideas, because it is.
On my calendar.
I know, that's great. And I do, I'm just going to keep coming back to this because I do really appreciate this. We do recognize that this is about more than just retail, and we really appreciate you all coming up. So do you guys have 2 more questions? And then you can come up and talk to us afterwards if you have any. Yeah, please.
So my question is, by looking at the map, you border on a highly residential historic street, and I guess my concern is hopefully that you're not thinking of bringing business that much closer to our residential along that border of, on the one side would be Bellevue, and on the other side would be Bloomingdale.
Yeah. I mean, we're not particularly looking to expand the commercial areas here. The reason why the border is what it is because that's the current zoning district. And so that's a regulatory sort of foundation that we can use. But the only thing that I will, talk about is we're not just going to stop at that line and saying like, hey, after you get to the edge of that, fictitious thing on the map, we're going to stop thinking about it. One thing that, we'll certainly be talking about is like the Radnor Trail's amazing, right? One of the things that brings people into downtown is you're on a bike ride. You need to go somewhere, get a cup of coffee, potentially fix a flat, and get back on your way. Connections to the Radnor Trail are really important, right? So we're going to be thinking about that in that relationship. So yeah, thank you.
As a former educator, I wanted to thank the woman who talked about the middle school.
Yeah.
And another thing that you really need to think about is how you coordinate with the school districts. I know we have Walk to Waynes for all the second graders,
Yep.
where they bring the kids to the schools, and if you work with the schools, and we have special internship programs, I know, where kids come from the high school.
Yep.
And if you can pull the students in, that will help you plan for the future, and also help bring the families into Wayne, because the kids will see something, and they'll tell their parents, you ought to see this.
Absolutely. I mean, I think there's a lot of, we're going to be thinking about sort of everybody as, users and the importance of them. We're going to be talking to every school, because it's not just a middle school. There's St. Catherine's that's right there, right? There's a lot of churches in that area that have a lot of historic, connection to the community. We're going to be talking to everybody along the way. So thank you for that. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. I'll be as quick as possible.
Yeah.
Your comment about the generation being more sober and drinking less, I was curious what data there might be about doing more drugs. There seems to be a lot of problems with that. So drinking less might be good, but I know there's a lot of drugs, and there's places that are legalizing more drugs. The comments about the kiosks, I've lived in Radnor, well, I'm 77, a bit older than most of the people here, except for you youngsters with color in your hair. And I walk around Wayne, and I have seen...
Can you make sure you're talking to the mic so we get it on
Right
the
into the mic, like,
Yeah.
oh,
Yeah.
what a difference. I have seen over 100 or so people dealing with the kiosks, looking, kind of squinting down. It might be raining, or the sun is hitting the screen. They're trying to punch buttons and do it and such, and I have found them to be worse rather than better. And when I've seen people doing that, I generally will stop and say, excuse me, but the meters stop at 6 o'clock. They're free on Sunday, holidays, and although it's not written in stone, they're free on Election Day. And they have a lot of confusion with that. The analogy you used of if you're getting chased by a bear, you don't have to be fast, just faster than your friends. I found that disconcerting. That sort of, if the Marines did that, or military did that, or the police or the firemen did that, a lot of people would be dead if they didn't stop to help their friends rather than run faster. I'm going to have to absorb, but you're quoting Mark Twain, it ain't what you don't know that gets you in trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so. You spoke about better mousetraps. A lot of this comes across to me, and I'm a bit older than one or two people might be near me, but I'm finding this whole thing an attempt to build a better mousetrap. Now, Wayne, Radnor, and I've lived right around here for quite a while, there is already a distinctive downtown in Wayne that it is already positioned as a destination, and people come from far and wide to come to the bars and the restaurants and the stores, and I see people from other communities on a regular basis. You used a lot of words that I would actually need a dictionary. The elasticity of friction, the role of psychographics, suburbanation of hip, differentiated food and beverage concepts, catalysts for revitalization. I'm almost done. You said there was a survey a year and a half ago at the beginning?
Yeah, so there was a, well, why don't you finish and then we'll
Okay, well, I'm not, okay. I really just wanted to touch on some things. I'm curious who is behind the money. You talked about consulting in New York City and the San Francisco Bay Area. In my understanding, that they're in great financial difficulty. Better mousetrap. Changing of the guard, that kind of caught my attention. I was wondering if you were from New York, just out of curiosity.
I was born there and I grew up in West.
You speak.
So I'm gonna take a moment now. If you have a question, please ask
Okay,
it.
no,
and
I'll
if,
finish. But you spoke faster than you flipped the things, and I thought it was very thoughtful of you to bring him a drink of water, which you didn't take a sip until you were completely done. I have a few more things that I would say, but I'll let it go at that
Okay.
because I know everybody wants to get home, and I'm sure you are both in a hurry.
Thank you.
For the time to speak.
Again, come out on Saturday. We will be there. We'll have plenty of time to talk. I really do. I know everybody is very busy. Thank you for taking the time for this. We're going to try to get this recording up on the website as soon as we possibly can. When we do, take a look at it. I don't know about you. I found so much information in this. I thought this was just so informative, and I do this on a regular basis. One of the key things with this is ultimately your plan. You all are the residents here. Mike and I are consultants. We work for the township. It's really important for you to help us get the word out about this. So if you've got your kids are in Little League, and you can spam your Little League group and be like, hey, there was this really interesting presentation. I think you should watch it. If you're part of the chamber, if you're connected to anything that anybody who's going to think like, hey, this would be really interesting, you know a retailer, please share this. We really need your help in getting the word out and the information out. And otherwise, we'll see you all on Saturday. All right? Thank you.
One of those horrible journalists that one of you mentioned. Do you have any kind of graph or anything? I have a pretty big social media.